Have you ever heard the sound of freedom? Have you ever heard the sound of freedom?
You're listening to The Flip Side with Noah Filipiak, connecting the reality of the gospel to the grit of life. You can support the podcast and pick up some sweet Flipside swag at www.patreon.com/Noah Filipiak.
What is up, Flipoponemi? Welcome to episode 85 of the Flipside podcast. We're getting closer and closer to that episode 100. Super glad to have you today. Thank you so much for listening. We have an interview with Dr. Terence Lester today. And Terence has been on the show before, back at episode 51. So you can go back after listening to today's episode if you want to check that episode out from 2 years ago. I would highly recommend that. It's great to be able to have guests on again and for me to get to know them deeper and the work they're doing. And Terence is doing some awesome work. So I'm going to read his bio here in a minute, and we'll jump right into to today's episode as we continue just challenging ourselves to grow in the areas of solidarity. And Terence, his work is with those that are unhoused, and he's now examining the intersection between racism and those that are unhoused and poverty, and how these two things play hand in hand historically. And frankly, there's so much for us to learn. Whether you're a person of color, whether you're white, there's been history that's been hidden from us, and it really does explain a lot about how we got to where we are and the types of things we need to do to undo the way that we got to where we are. And there's so many biblical parallels. And so to me, these are discipleship conversations. And I encourage you to continue to grow in these areas of discipleship. For some of us, these are just areas, these are muscles on our body that have never been used. So if you had surgery and you don't use a muscle for a while, it becomes emaciated, right? It shrivels up. It becomes very small. Your left calf will be way smaller than your right calf, and you can't put any weight on it. All those sorts of things. That's what happens in our discipleship. And I think often in this area of solidarity, this area of compassion, empathy, area of justice, when it comes to racial justice, and it's particularly in the United States, but certainly in the first century too, there was the circumstances were different, but Jesus was dealing with many of the same issues. When we've grown up in environments where this piece of our discipleship hasn't been addressed, the muscle is very small and weak, and so it can be painful to put pressure on it. I just want to encourage you to continue to put pressure on it, to be gradual with it, but like a physical therapist would do. This is spiritual therapy. I mean, this is where we're saying we're going to get that muscle stronger. That muscle's been neglected. And so on the flip side, we're going to have episodes like this one, episodes like the last one, episode 84, with Doctors Bracey and Emerson, where we're getting deep into this stuff, and it's to strengthen those muscles. So thank you for having the courage to strengthen in these areas, because doing physical therapy, I've torn my ACL 3 times. It's not for the birds. It's no joke. There's pain. Dr. Lester today, he's going to talk about his own journey of having to relearn how to walk, after a near fatal car accident. And there's physical pain involved in that, but it's worth it. It's worth it to get stronger, to be able to walk again or run again. And the same goes spiritually for us when it comes to this neglected area of our discipleship. So before I read Terence's bio and jump into the interview, I want to give a shout out to Angry Brew. Got my Flipoponymous, I'm a Flipoponymous mug today that I'm rocking. Thank you to Angry Brew for sponsoring the show. You can go to angrybrew.com, 5lakes.com, use promo code FLIP, and you'll get 10% off your order. Angry Brew is coffee with a punch, twice the caffeine of regular coffee. Pretty fun product. And also Chris's Blend, $1 of every order helps out an orphanage in Honduras, and that is awesome. It's a Christian-owned company, and we're really thankful to be able to support them and for them to support us. So use promo code FLIP to get 10% off your order. And then we've been talking on the podcast about how to keep the podcast sustainable. That's my goal. I hope it's your goal as well. One free way you can do that is to take your favorite Flipside episode and share it on your social media page. Share a line or two to your friends of why you like this episode, and encourage them to listen and to become a listener as well. You can also join our Patreon team, which is growing, and that is patreon.com/Noah Filipiak. For a small monthly donation, you can help keep the podcast sustainable And if you'd like, you can get some sweet swag like a Flip-A-Potomi mug. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Terence Lester. He is the founder of Love Beyond Walls, a not-for-profit on poverty awareness and community mobilization. His work has been featured in USA Today, Black Enterprise, Essence, Reader's Digest, The Today Show, and Good Morning America. He was named by Coca-Cola as one of their history shakers. His books include I See You and When We Stand, and he lives with his family in Atlanta, Georgia. And his newest book, All God's Children, How Confronting Buried History Can Build Racial Solidarity, from InterVarsity Press, is available now, and encourage you to check it out. So with that, let's jump in to Dr. Lester's second visit on the flip side. Here we go.
Ever heard the sound of freedom? Have you ever heard the sound of
Well, I am very pleased to welcome back to the flip side as a returning guest, Dr. Terence Lester. Terence, welcome back, man.
Noah, I am really excited about being back. It's been 2 years.
2 years, dude. It's crazy. We were just catching up, and it's amazing how much happens in 2 years, but how fast it goes. It's wild, dude. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, life has been, as they say, lifing
Yeah, yes, it has.
in many different ways.
Yeah.
And man, I'm just glad to be alive. I'm glad to be, able to communicate and walk and just take in all of the small blessings that many people take for granted each day.
Yeah. So 2 years ago, when we talked, you were not yet Dr. Terence Lester. So I'd love to hear about that. But also 2 years ago, you hadn't had your accident yet. I don't think. I'm trying to think of the exact timeline. I don't think you had. And you're alluding to it there. And can you just catch listeners up a little bit on your accident and your recovery and what that was like for you emotionally? But at the same time, you're still working on a PhD at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. 2 years ago, I was probably a year and a half into my PhD, was really thinking about social constructions related to the unhoused community and those who are impoverished. And so that led me on a journey to, researching the history of homelessness in the United States, the two mass homelessness eras, the intersectionality between homelessness and race, and all of these different things. And I'm getting closer and closer to like literally trying to find out what my question is for my dissertation. And that's when, I'm made aware of a policy that is about to pass in the state of Tennessee that literally makes sleeping outside for those who are unhoused a felony.
Hmm.
And so while I'm thinking about this, about a year and some change go by. And in March of, no, it was May of 2022, May 14th, I was involved in a near fatal car accident with my wife. We had gone out to dinner and we were celebrating, some progress in our organization, and we left there. And I asked her if she would drive, and she says, "Yeah, I would drive." And I fell asleep in the passenger seat, not thinking anything about not being able to get home to my children. And next thing I know, I wake up on the ground with EMTs running over to my body. And I still remember one saying out loud to the crowd that was watching, "Flip him over to see if he's still alive."
Wow.
That landed me in the hospital, spent 26 days in the hospital, had 2 surgeries, and that left me unable to walk. Really damaged my hip and my pelvis, broke both of them really bad. And for the next months, I got out of the hospital, had to go through all of this physical therapy, had to learn how to walk again. And it was just gut wrenching and emotional and traumatizing, and the grief. And, for the first time in my life, I could not move, and it wrecked me. And I'll stop there. I know you want to probe, but I had to learn many, many different lessons on the journey to recovery and, grief and faith and all of those things.
Yeah. Well, and you're pretty transparent about your journey on Twitter, which I appreciated. Just asking people for prayer and
Yeah.
celebrating the wins, but like being honest about the grief and I was praying for you along the way, and
Oh, thank you.
just appreciated um your transparency there as you walk through that. And I mean, it's awesome to see you today continuing your work, and um you've to see you walk across the stage, got to watch the video of
Yeah.
that. And I mean,
Yeah.
it's tremendous. And I wondered, I wanted to catch up with you. We talked 2 years ago is episode 51 of Here on the Flip Side. If listeners want to go back and listen to that, you could listen to episode 51 and then listen to today. We are on episode 85, and for a listener it'll go by in a few seconds from one to the other.
Yeah.
For you, it's been quite the 2-year journey, and I'm wondering, hopefully I'm not packing too much into this question here, but in that episode we talked about racism, we talked about the church, we talked about justice theology, ministering to people without addresses, and centering it on, we've talked literally, what does it mean to follow Jesus? So here's Jesus walking like this. We're literally going to walk the way he's walking. And so what I'm wondering is, 2 years later, what does that road look like for you today? Both like, what are you up to today? What does that road look like? But then you've had to display a tremendous amount of endurance. You've had a lot of discouragements and encouragements along the way. And I'm just wondering if that changed your approach at all, in any way, now than just, where things were at a few years ago.
Yeah. I mean, a few years ago, I was really thinking about community and, really amplifying the voices of those who were unhoused. I mean, 2 years ago, we were still dealing with, all sorts of residue from COVID. Not saying that we aren't right now, but, we were kind of in the throes of it. And so I was still thinking like a frontline worker, right? So to speak, being very proximate to people in really the crucible of their lives, in conjunction with what is going on in society and culture, and then trying to reconcile, you know, my faith and whether it's a church play a part in this,
Yeah.
and watching the church be really silent on a lot of issues related to, you know, um, the racial justice issues of our day, and sort of like the class issues that many people who we were serving and listening to were being impacted by some of those very things. And so I started to see, like, this deeper need for me to speak out
Mhm.
about these things, but also to make it very clear for those who didn't understand where some of the structural issues related to those who are impoverished actually comes from. And so when you talk about intersectionality and the connection between race and class and things, I wanted to be more explicit in, kind of unpacking that. And so I've continued that work. I've kind of like regained a renewed sense of call and purpose related to that work. And so here you are, a few years later, I'm writing about the intersection of race and class, and some of the things that I've experienced as a Black man navigating all of that, and
Yeah.
being a champion of standing in solidarity with those who are overlooked while advocating for myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's a good lead in. I've got your new book here, All God's Children. So that's
Yeah.
awesome. Great book. Congratulations on the new book. And we'll have a link to the book in the show notes for listeners to check out. Let me read the subtitle: All God's Children, How Confronting Buried History Can Build Racial Solidarity. And one of my first questions regarding the book, because you mentioned it in there and you were just mentioning it now, what is the connection between the work you do with anti-poverty and anti-racism? Because it's not always a connection that people put together. Yet when you start to look at our history, you can't really separate the two.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great question. You know, intersectionality itself was kind of like this theory that was introduced to the legal field by a Black feminist scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw. And what this term does is it presents a framework that kind of describes how overlapping social identities and social structures related to racism and a class or oppression kind of intersect. And the best way I can describe this, right, uh, for someone who may not understand and will be afraid of this term, for example, a Black person, right, who is unhoused, right, or dealing with poverty, because Joe Blue in his book, The Visible Poor, would argue that we shouldn't be separating homelessness from the word poverty, because if you are unhoused, then you are poor, right? So a Black person who is unhoused might experience discrimination not only for their housing status, right, but they may also experience discrimination because they are also Black.
Mm-hmm.
Two different identities overlapping, causing the compounded nature of discrimination. Case in point, when I was doing my PhD research, I focused on the state of Tennessee. Why? Because the state of Tennessee passed a law that makes sleeping outside a felony. As a part of my dissertation, I did a traditional paper, and then I wanted to do a creative component. And so a part of my dissertation was to shoot a documentary. I went over to the state of Tennessee, and I'll never forget traveling to 4 cities, just doing street interviews. I lived on the streets and interviewed people in their context. I was less than a mile away when I was in Memphis from the very place that ML King was assassinated for taking a stand against poor, sanitation workers who were Black.
Yeah.
I was interviewing a lady named Catherine. She was a white woman, a beautiful spirit. And I asked her, I say, how do you survive? And she starts to talk about all of the challenges related to the law and her sense of self-worth. But then she gets to this really important point. She says, at least I can walk into a restaurant or a hotel and use my whiteness to access a restaurant.
Wow.
But I feel bad for my Black friends who are experiencing homelessness. I said, well, what do you say? Why do you say that? And she says, because if you're Black and unhoused in the city, not only do you have to deal with not having an address, but people are still racist. And I mean, that's just the clearest example of like the importance of understanding how race can uphold classism, or as Isabel Wilkerson argues in her book, this caste system that causes people to be at the bottom. And so it's important when I think about, linking, anti-racism work to anti-poverty work, because, throughout history, you can actually see systemic things that were upheld by white supremacy that causes the residue of why people are faced with some of the challenges that are related to their impoverishment today.
Yeah. And I can give, I don't know if it's testimony is the right word. It's I'm embarrassed of it, but I grew up in the white suburbs of Dayton, Ohio. So out, out away from Dayton, and my town, it was just mostly all white people, and nobody ever taught me this. Like, I think this is the thing. Nobody ever gets up at church or my parents never sat me down and said, people are poor because they're lazy. People are poor because they didn't do their homework. They're poor because they made bad choices, right? And they're poor. And so don't be that, as long as you work hard and, do your homework and and whatever, and make good choices, you won't be poor. And so you just immediately get this explanation given to you, which is I'm not poor because I made good choices, and they're poor because they made bad choices. And meanwhile, everybody in my suburban middle class town is white. And if you were to drive through, urban Dayton, Ohio, or where I live now, urban Grand Rapids, Michigan, or Atlanta, or any city, in the US, you're going to find highly concentrated populations of African Americans and now Latino folks as well.
Yeah.
If you don't know your history, okay, so there's a couple options here. You never were taught it by intentionally education systems that are intentionally ignoring it, right? Or
Right.
you were taught it, or you had the opportunity to be taught it, and you rejected it as false or something, right? But when you don't know your history, you become this really, well, so we use the word ignorant. That just means you don't know. Ignorance just means you don't know something. Like if you don't know how to drive a car, you shouldn't be behind a wheel. You have to have a knowledge or whatever it may be. Just kind of if you don't have the knowledge about history of race, you're trying to function in a society where the problem is you think you know because Fox News is telling you things about poverty and you think they must be right, or just whatever it may be. Okay, I'll try to land my plane here on what I'd call, I don't know if testimony is the right word, but when we talked a little bit before about Divided by Faith, and when I read that book, where so listeners listening to this for the first time, just interviewed Dr. Michael Emerson and Dr. Glenn Bracey last episode of The Flip Side, to be episode 84, on their new book coming out, Religion of Whiteness. But when I read Divided by Faith back in 2008, I was living in urban Lansing, Michigan, planting a church in urban Lansing, Michigan, and I was in proximity, and I lived on the block, and I was we were doing a park ministry down the street at the park. And every kid at the park is black, and everybody at my church plant is white. And the kids start coming to my church. They start walking to church because they like me, they know me, they know they're going to be loved and we have food. And so I still have all these old assumptions from growing up about why people are poor. And I can't even hardly say this out loud, Terence, but it is such a racist, racial stereotype that we as white folks end up having, that because there's this concentrated population of black folks that are poor in the urban core, but then we were taught you're poor because you're lazy and you made bad choices. You look at black folks that are poor and you go, well, you're lazy and make bad choices, and you think how racist, right, of a thought that is.
Right.
And that is born into me like a baby drinking from a bottle. I just feel like I was literally raised on that. So all this to land a plane and say, it wasn't until Divided by Faith, George Yancey and Michael Emerson came to my seminary and did a one-day talk, and I was in a class where we were talking about these things. And when I started to learn the history about redlining, and I started to learn the history about Jim Crow laws, and I started to learn the history about Reconstruction and how it failed and why it failed and what happened after Reconstruction failed, then I started to go, oh, it clicked. And I went, this is an injustice. This is a justice issue. This has nothing to do with somebody that made, bad choices and whatnot. So all that to say, sorry about that long lead in here. You write about all that stuff in All God's Children. And so I want to hear from you on why you wrote All God's Children. We kind of have touched on it already. But why did you feel like it was necessary to travel, again, confronting buried history so we can build racial solidarity? Why is that such an important step for you?
I think a number of reasons why I really wanted to write the book. Firstly, I'm a person of faith, and I've had the opportunity to navigate a lot of different spaces, right? predominantly white spaces, predominantly Black spaces, which is a part of my historical upbringing and my, induction into the faith. Latin spaces, Asian spaces, just a lot of different spaces, right? But particularly, it wasn't until I started navigating mostly white led spaces, and I would find myself as the only Black person in the space, the only Black communicator. Even when I look at the seminaries that I went to, or the Bible college, I was always in a minority group. And when I look at my upbringing, my K through 12 experience, I noticed like this intentional exclusion related to
Mm.
Black history,
Yeah.
and it wasn't until I started to have conversations with my grandparents to kind of get that oral tradition of like their lived experiences that kind of opened my eyes to, oh, like I'm connected to this heritage of triumph, but also of pain and suffering that our people have experienced. And I did not learn that anywhere. I
Mm.
remember times being in Bible college wondering why Black history wasn't talked about, wondering why, Black scholars or Black apologists or Black church fathers, right, weren't, center in the conversation. And it was always being left out. And then fast forward, as I started to encounter this information and we see all of these racial justice issues surface, from the killing of Mike Brown to George Floyd to Philando Castile. I mean,
Hmm.
Breonna Taylor. You could time and time again when I would be in predominantly white spaces, nothing would be said. As a matter of fact, um, I kind of write about this. There would be more questions than concerns. There would be more critique of the individuals whose lives were taken than actual care and concern as to how this is connected to history. And I go, oh my God, like we need a robust confrontation, right? And confrontation doesn't have to be negative all the time.
Yeah.
We need to really sit with the connection between what has happened and how that continues to show up today. I mean, man, my grandmother is 91 years old. She's still sharp of mind. She just visited our organization, walked through our Dignity Museum, and stood in the museum and told me she was born in 1932,
Mm.
during the Great Depression. She remembers not being able to go to a museum, not being able to work in certain stores, and she's verbalizing this to me, not being able to access good textbooks and being concentrated on certain parts of the city because of fear for her blackness and her life being taken if she would have navigated outside of those confines. She remembers how poverty was concentrated. She remembers all of these things. And I go like, why don't we understand some of these connections? Because she talks to me about her parents and their grandparents and how they weren't given access to read. But yet we see it in the state of Florida right now, some of the same connections
Yeah.
that are happening with book banning because of this fear of CRT. But in reality, it's banning Black history and the things that actually happen. And so I say we need to confront it because when we confront it, we understand and we are aware what we don't need to do to repeat it and how best we might be able to stand and honor the dignity of our brothers and sisters who also are a part of the faith, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That was actually my next question, was about the, I think it was a few months ago when it hit Ron DeSantis made African American studies illegal in Florida schools. So the AP courses in the high schools, I think it was, and he banned them, and I know
Yeah.
um Dr. Emerson in the last episode was just talking about he knows people in higher education, Christian education even, that are I guess I'm trying to remember the context he mentioned, if it was like public schools, high school. It was just kind of in general, kind of that high school, college. It didn't matter. Both formally, people who were afraid I will get fired if I talk about. And when we say CRT, that's like a boogeyman word nowadays, right? We're talking about history. We're just talking about the systems that created our culture, and they're the things I just rattled off, things like redlining, things like, Jim Crow laws, the things that created the real estate environment we have today, the things that created the economic environment that we have today, right? And so these things are oh, jump in. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, yesterday would have been Emmett Till's 82nd birthday, right? The men who brutally lynched Emmett Till when he was a teenager got off of their murder charges because a group of their peers who were in the jury, right, in this legal system, literally gave them an escape from not dealing with the responsibilities and being held accountable for their actions against a Black child, a Black body. CRT, right, in its theoretical basis is academic. It's a legal framework that denotes that there is some systemic issues, right, of racism that's embedded in education, in housing, in employment, in healthcare, and even the legal system, right, that got those white men off, that they later told that they committed this crime against a Black boy. And so, I think it has become a boogeyman because it has been hijacked to be used in political rhetoric that has coded language that stokes a base of people who want to make America great again, or who want to uphold this form of white supremacy and whiteness that in many ways have continued to promote violence and harm and division, and an ideology that literally blames those who have been harmed by historical things as the reason why this should be banned. And so, like, they say CRT, but what they're really talking about is Black history.
Yeah. And when you see lead politicians, now someone running for president who's trying to make this stuff literally illegal. So what Emerson was saying is he has friends who have said, I can't talk about that or I'll get fired. Or those who have talked about it and they get ostracized by their, and we were in the context of talking about, practicing white Christians and how prevalent this is in what Bracy and Emerson called the religion of whiteness. And how this got picked up by white evangelicals. And you can go on to, I know, like, the Gospel Coalition has an article or two about CRT and why it's evil and why it's this great sin and all this kind of thing. And you just, I want listeners to be really careful about, I want listeners to be able to slow down and to be able to stop. And when we see, so I think you mentioned this in your book, but anyway, just this idea that history, to me, history should be objective and non-threatening. It's just like, hey, here's some history. This is what happened. Like, this is what happened. We can learn from it. So when you have people that are literally trying to censor history, they're trying to change history, right? And I think of those that deny the Holocaust happened, and most Americans, sensible, 99.9% of Americans would be like, the Holocaust happened, y'all. Like, if you deny it, you've got issues, right? Like, you could
major issues,
right? But without, that's what's happening with this. Like, when we're trying to deny that and the other thing to it, I think there's this brand of like thinking within certain schools of white thought that, well, that happened such a long time ago, let's move on. And your example, well, and then there's several layers there. Your example of your grandma is a great one, where people literally living today were under the thumb of Jim Crow laws still. You
Yes.
can watch,
Yes.
you don't have to be a scholar, you don't even have to read a book. You can watch like Bryan Stevenson's Just Mercy movie, and you'll
Yeah.
see that this is like Brian's whole life in the legal system. His whole life in the legal system is facing racism after racism after racism. And you just watch that movie and you go, oh, or you mentioned Emmett Till, the movie Till, T-I-L-L. Someone go watch that, and you will see that wasn't that long ago. First of all, that I always say, like, back would be, that we're talking about the 50s, the 60s. This is when the Beatles were popular. Elvis Presley was popular, like that was music my parents listened to growing up. This is the music I was listened to in the back seat growing up. This is still our lifetime, and the things that
1955.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was murdered August 28th, 1955. It's not that long ago. Not that long ago at all. And man, I remember, I mean, I talk about this in the book, but I remember the talks that I was given, right? And the talk is more of like a rites of passage in the Black community when, elders or grandparents or parents talk to their children about what it means to be Black, how to navigate certain spaces, how to protect yourself against violence from, going out into the world, how to mitigate harm if you're pulled over by the police officers. Like, you're actually taught, right, how to survive. Like, if you go in the store, make sure you have your hands out of your pocket. Or, if you go in the store, like, I still remember these talks, and somebody starts following you around because they view you as a criminal or a thief, pull your money out of your pocket. Don't go into stores when you are in a group. Never show public emotion, right? You couldn't be sad in public. Like, all of these nuanced things about how to survive. And I remember like getting this information as early as age 9. There's research right now that says the talk is even given starting at as early as age 6 for Black children, where you encounter like these adult racially constructed ideas about race and class as early as age 6 because of your skin color, right? And I argue for people to consider what talk they were given, whether it was verbally or non-verbally, right? What environments were you in? I still remember sitting across from my grandfather and him talking to me about Emmett Till before I was 14 years old. I was 9 years old, bro, and him using that story because he was alive when it happened. And he was talking to me about, the types of the things that I would face because of my skin color, right? I have a PhD right now, and it doesn't matter. Like, I have friends who are police officers that are Black. When they get off of work, if they are pulled over, they have just as much as fear as a person who is not law enforcement because of the color of their skin, right? I've been in rooms where I have been blatantly, thought of as a janitor. I've had white people come up to me in several environments and just see me in a lens that is menial and just like nothing, kind of being lesser than, right? And like, these are the types of things that we're talking about. Like, when you talk about de jure law or de jure law versus de facto discrimination, de jure discrimination, it is the redlining, it is the war on drugs, it is mandatory minimums, it is some of the things that we have seen historically that was written by policy. And although some of those things have been removed, they still show up de facto, right, is by fact in the hearts of people, right? And that's what we need to pause and consider in this moment. How the structural things have created such a toxic environment that even though some of those things have been done away with, it's still showing up in the hearts and the minds of people who are now in power, who have the power to ban a book or ban education or say, slavery. Like people
Oh,
benefited from
oh,
slavery,
right.
enslavement.
Oh,
Slavery was rape, slavery was torture, slavery was murder, slavery was separation of families. Slavery was not an internship. It was not a program that was set up or designed for Africans who were enslaved in this country to benefit from it. It was capitalism. It was using Black bodies as property. It was all of these things, and we have to consider what type of message we are sending, or the persons who are doing this are sending, when they don't include the Black narrative. And the reason I'm so passionate about this is because how can you say you're worshiping in a church and you may be sitting next to your Black or brown friend who may be Black or Latin or a Pacific Islander or Asian American or whatever, but yet want to uphold the denial or the
mm,
erasure of that sister or brother in the faith's history. To really love your neighbor, you got to love everything that has shaped them. You got to love the neighborhood that they emerged from, and you have to be concerned with the issues that
yeah,
neighborhood faces. And I'll
yeah,
say that time and time again. Yeah.
yeah. 1 Corinthians 12, when one part of the body suffers, all parts suffer. I think that's such a verse that we in the white church have just completely neglected.
Mm.
Just like, you're not suffering. Actually, you're fine. Or we don't care that you're suffering.
Mm.
And it's really telling. So you mentioned in All God's Children, empathy, compassion, and understanding as three things that play a really important role in this. And I think about
Yeah.
empathy, compassion, understanding. And you think if you could kind of boil down to your children, sometimes, my kids are 11, 9, and 6, and it really tests your mettle as a theologian when your kids start asking you questions and you have to
Yeah.
explain it and break it down to them. And I think, one of the ways you could explain what does it mean to live like a Christian, to your kids, I think you could really
Mm.
center a good argument around empathy, compassion, and understanding that when we have Jesus inside of us,
Yes.
it gives us, and because we believe in grace, that's my big thing. It's like we believe in grace, we believe we're
Yes.
forgiven.
Yes.
Everybody's broken. Jesus makes us whole. So because of that, man, I just have empathy for others
Mm.
and compassion for others and understanding because we're all in the same boat. Like we all just need grace. We need Jesus. That should be a fruit of what it means, to follow Jesus. So I lead into that because Christians ought to be the best at this. Christians ought to be
Mm.
the best equipped to have empathy, compassion, and understanding for, in this case, I'm specifically, as we've been talking about, white Christians to have empathy, compassion, understanding for Christians of color, for Black Christians with the specific history that we're talking about here. And so we, again, it's this, I'm thinking about, because I just interviewed Doctors Bracy and Emerson, and in their research, they just have not found that is that is true. That it's practicing white Christians who do not have empathy, compassion, and understanding, towards these historical facts, towards Christians of color, towards people of color in the United States, towards this history. So let's try to shift towards listeners today. Listeners are listening to this. I want listeners
Yeah.
to read All God's Children. I want us to know that we can make a difference. One, I want us to know we're in a point of history we can't just be spectators at. This Ron DeSantis stuff, like, this is scary stuff, man. And I always tell my listeners, I'm not telling you to vote Republican. I'm not telling you to vote Democrat. I'm not telling you that. I am telling you there's certain candidates that you need to be aware of what they're selling, and that when a candidate is trying to get votes literally based on racism and is trying to conjure up oftentimes Christians trying to conjure up a base of voters based on these really old racist narratives. We can't be okay with that as Christians. Like, this is injustice in our land, in our society, and we need to call it out. So we need to know that that's going on. But I also want
Yeah.
listeners to know you can make a difference. You don't have to stand on the sideline. You can be a change agent, and we need that today. One of the ways to be a change agent is empathy, compassion, and understanding. So I'd love, Terence, to just hear from you a little bit more on that as a tool, if that's the right word, or some practical help with how do those three things play a role in anti-poverty work as well as in anti-racism work?
Yeah. Wow. Empathy. Um, one of my friends says is a virtue that is muscular enough to handle the complexities of our day.
Hmm.
I think that is empathy is huge because at the core of solidarity work is empathy. Empathy makes space for lamentation, right? Where you have genuine concern when you lament with others. When we think about lamentation in the scriptures, lament itself, has space for suffering, the outcries, the doubt, the challenges, the hope, the fears, the questions to God. Like, lament it within itself creates this environment where we are petitioning God and we're crying out from the depths of all of that we are experiencing. I would say that empathy is in connection with lament because let's just say that someone is suffering, and you choose to stand in solidarity with them. I think through the hearing of a person's lament, their cries, what they're faced with, by you being in close proximity to them, then allowing your heart to be open enough where you join in that lament, that builds the type of connection where you're saying, like, I'm grieved at this. I'm grieved that people don't have access to a shower
Hmm.
when I woke up this morning and I got a chance to shower. I'm grieved that during COVID, people who were unhoused didn't have access to sanitation to wash their hands when they were saying that. I'm grieved that a person um, has to wake up and kind of decide whether they're going to spend their money on the ability to wash their clothes at a laundry or purchase food for their child. Like, I'm grieved at that, and I'm standing in solidarity. I'm crying out. I'm listening to their griefs and grievances and their suffering, and that should move me, right? To have the type of compassion and empathy where I join in that lament. God, what can we do to
Hmm.
help? What
Yeah.
can we build to help? What can we practically do to serve our neighbor, right? Isn't that at the core of what Jesus says he comes to earth to do? He literally took off all of glory and all of those things. He says, for the Son of Man didn't come to earth to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. That same type of framework, when we are like engaging people in their suffering and their lament, as how can I serve? How can I give my life for my neighbor? How can I sacrifice for my neighbor? How can I ensure that my neighbor understands that they too are part of the beloved community of God, right?
Hmm.
And then we have to listen, right? We have to listen and we have to learn. But listening and learning doesn't come with the type of listening and learning that has editing within it,
Hmm.
right? Where you are engaging your neighbor and you want to practice this performative solidarity work where you want to be close to your neighbor and you want to say you love your neighbor, but you want to edit the stories that they're telling, right? I think that type of censorship does a disservice to those people who are suffering, right? It's lamentation, then it's listening. And listening is sometimes a ministry within itself. It's the ministry of presence. It creates an opportunity for people to just talk, right? And be their full selves without the fear of being edited. And then it's learning from others, but not putting the onus onto people to make them teach you, right?
Yeah.
It's about learning because you have been proximate and built the relationship. And through the relationship, you're learning things about the person that you say that you care about. And then there's immersion, right? You're immersed in the world of another, so much so that you indirectly understand the ways in which you can be of service to another person, and you get a chance to understand the worldview of another person. When it has come to like doing this practical ministerial work, the best things that I've benefited from have been getting to know people.
Yeah.
Have been pausing my life long enough to be immersed in somebody else's world, even if my world is different, to build that relationship, to understand the cries and the fears and the hopes, but then to pray to God and ask, how may I be of service and how might I stand in solidarity with this neighbor that I say I love, that you called me to love?
Mm.
And from there, you know, I think the empathy and the compassion continues to develop, and you find more ways to stand alongside your neighbor. And then that's when you use your voice, because all of that work before you start to use your voice, is essential, because you're getting an opportunity to spend time with people that you're going to speak up for,
Yeah.
you know and I think that's important. I think compassion, empathy, all of this is at the core of what we see Jesus doing in the scriptures. The way that he talked to people, the way that he saw people, the way that he was tender with people, the way
Yeah.
that he heard people's cries, the way that, he offered support and solidarity, the way that he groaned with the pains of people, right? When Lazarus dies, he weeps. We follow a Jesus that weeps. Like, if we literally looked at the life of Jesus and asked ourselves, how could we best model some of the ways in which Jesus lived in our context, not trying to cookie cutter anything, that would lead us to a lot of answers that we've been seeking.
Man, you're making some great connections just to scripture there as you're talking. I'm picturing Jesus. If we could really picture Jesus and the way he walked in first century Palestine, and he's walking around, just the people he's hanging out with, and it was not the people that was expected that a religious leader would hang out with. And that was one of
Right.
the reasons he got rejected, is because he didn't pander to the powerful. He just he incarnated. Like we sing
Yes.
about Emmanuel, God with us, and we're so glad
Mm.
he incarnated to us, and I think that's where the individualism of the American evangelical gospel really falls short, because we go, man, the gospel, gospel, gospel. He incarnated to become like you. He became one of us. But I just think of that as cool. Like, he became like Noah, became like me. And so, as if me and Jesus are in this exclusive club together, and he incarnated amongst the broken people in his society. And I'm no different. It's not that, like, it's just that our society has, oh my goodness, I get so sad sometimes when I look at how the way our society was built, and we've created the class system, like the caste system that Isabel Wilkerson talks about. But Jesus, there's Bible verses where he's the words the scriptures use is he's eating, that they call a glutton and a drunkard, because he's eating dinner with tax collectors and sinners. He's hanging out with prostitutes, right? These are just the words scriptures use. This was his crew. These are the people he hung out with. And it would have been the poor people of culture. It was not the elite class. It was the poor class. And that is what it means to live like Jesus, right? So, okay, so lots of scripture there. I'm just connecting those dots, and I want listeners to connect those dots too. My next question is practical. So, you know, I don't know. Most of my listeners are probably white. Most of my circle still, I mean, I'm white. It's just how it is, right? Like my family, my friends, my people I went to high school with. So if you're if you're listening to this as a white person, sometimes there's this challenge, and I love that you talk about proximity in All God's Children. So that's what we're going to get to here. Proximity can feel difficult when let's say you're white and you're living in an all white town. You're living in one of these suburban towns or a rural town. There's lots of rural towns, man. If you look at like Michigan is just filled with these rural towns. You go north, it's just like white everywhere.
Yeah.
You get outside of a urban center and it's white everywhere. So you tend to go to a white church if you're in an all white town. Though, let me just be real, there's plenty of people living in the suburbs or on like the edges of the suburban and the urban who don't have to go to a white church, but who choose to. But let's say you're going to a white church, your circle is white, everything's white around you. You could move for sure. That's an option. Let's say moving is not an option. I just want to be really real and practical. I don't want to beat listeners up. I'm not trying to beat listeners up. I want to help listeners take one step, right? To take one step forward, because one step I think will lead to two. Once you take a step, you're like, oh, there's something here, and then you find the rabbit hole eventually.
Yeah.
But what is that first step, do you feel like, for listeners who find themselves in that boat?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a real thing, right? Communities tend to be homogenous in that, you're in closer proximity to those who are more like you, and you can't really be physically proximate, right? So we have to sometimes resort to cognitive proximity. you know um I remember going through Bible college, and majority of the people that I read were white scholars, white authors, right? And it wasn't until like I really opened up the world to realize that there were so many black and brown authors that I had yet to read that spoke to my existence. And so like I started collecting books similar to you, Noah, and just really immersing myself. And that caused me to be cognitively proximate to my own history and heritage. You know, diet isn't just about what you're eating. Diet can be who you're listening to, you know. I would challenge people to be proximate cognitively and listen to black leaders. When was the last time you heard a black person give a sermon, right? What books are you reading that were written by black authors, right? And this is not a shameless plug for my book or anything. Just read black literature or black and brown literature. When was the last time you looked up a historical fact about black history in relationship to CRT? I mean, you can just start making mental shifts slowly. Like you start with one book, or you start with one sermon, or you start with one podcast, or you sit at the table in the book. I label one chapter "Sit at Another's Table," and what I'm really describing as like when you invite somebody to your table, you're eating their meal. They own the table.
Yeah.
It's like they're tailoring the conversation, right? But when you go to another person's table and get a meal, whether it be via book or podcast or whatever, you have to pause long enough to sit with how something has been prepared that your hands did not touch. That is the message, right? And then you can start to slowly, whether if you wanted to, where do you buy your coffee, right? If you order it online, why not support a black business? Where do you get your clothes? Why not patronize a small black business that may not get as much, patrons because of it's just those subtle shifts in like how you begin to align yourself with supporting people that are not like you. And I think that is the true essence of what Jesus is saying. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's easy to love people who are right around you, right? It's harder to practice that same love with someone who is not like you. And that's what I'm really calling people to do, to consider the ways in which they have made small decisions to stand in solidarity with people who are also the beloved people of God.
Yeah. And talk about biblical stuff. The Good Samaritan parable, the whole thing is about what you just said, loving your neighbor. It's all about racism and these ethnic
Yes.
divides in the culture. And Jesus is so countercultural in the stuff that he talks about in Good Samaritan. So let me ask you this, and then well, I'll get you out of here after this question. So my question is, can you rattle off to us some books, movies, TV shows, maybe like docuseries, podcasts that you would recommend, and feel free to give us as many or few as you want. And then I want to just kind of see if you have any like closing thoughts that you want to give before we wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I do really well, even at the end of each chapter in the book, is I give like a small practical thing that a person can implement right
Nice.
away.
Great.
Also, in the appendix of the book, I give a list of books to read, further education material, as well as films to watch. I mean, I can
Nice.
rattle off some.
Yeah.
Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Go Tell It on the Mountain, James Baldwin, Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison, one of my good friends, Dr. Jamar Tisby, The Color of Compromise, or he has a new book that he's working on, The Spirit of Justice. Esau McCulley, Reading While Black. A good friend of mine, Lamar Hartwick, Disability and the Church. He actually has a book that's coming out that deals with ableism and racism and their connection.
Mm-hmm.
Where Do We Go From Here by Martin Luther King Jr. Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone. I mean,
Yeah.
it's tons of resources that I outline, but greater than that, man, people could easily type in, things online. We search for things all day on Google, or now use AI, right? People are using AI, but like, I would just really take a moment, just pick one book, or one article, right? Don't try to overwhelm yourself and buy a stack of books that are probably just going to sit on the shelf. Just like pick something that speaks to you. Start with, a couple pages, 10 pages here, 10 pages there, and just kind of process what you're going to read,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I found the appendix. Awesome. So you have the films or TV series to watch as well, which I think can be helpful. Not everybody reads and that sort of thing. And just your first one on the list, 13th. I was really impressed with 13th. I feel like they're able to condense so much history into an hour and a half or whatever the film is. But just to give listeners, the podcast listener, heads up, there's a great list there of movies and shows to watch as well. So that's great. And I want to still push people to that second step. Take the first step, be cognitive solidarity. But there are ways, even if you live in a rural area. I mean, there are ways to connect in person, and maybe it's volunteering at a nonprofit. That's
right.
Drive 30 minutes to a nonprofit and volunteer.
That's right.
45 minutes to a nonprofit and volunteer. I mean, that's not that long of a drive. I really want to push listeners into that. If you don't have a home church or you're looking to make a change, I mean, really look at churches that are multi-ethnic, or look at churches that are ethnic churches, or churches that are just homogenous, not white churches, and just go visit at least. Consider just there are the in-person piece is really big, and there's so many opportunities out there, particularly in the nonprofit world, to get involved. I mean, take advantage of that.
Take advantage, get involved, because I mean, through that service, you get a chance to roll up your sleeves, be with people, and be doing the work as well.
Yeah. And let me say this too. I don't just mean nonprofit world, like I'm going to go serve poor people, which it's about bringing proximity and hearing stories and picking nonprofits like Love Beyond Walls that are led by strong Black leaders, that are led by people of color, and where if I'm white, I can go to that nonprofit and sit under and learn from and be in community with. And the more you do that, you start to realize that it's not about the divisions that we create socioeconomically. It's about being in. It truly becomes about solidarity. When you start to hear stories, you start to go, we're literally all human, and man, that is faith in practice. That is faith in practice. That is the living out of our faith. And so that's my challenge to listeners. And I trust that God will provide an opportunity, for listeners, for you to be able to do that in your place where you are, in your context. So, Terence, can you just give us give listeners a final concluding thought or word for this episode?
Yeah, I've been really moved by this quote that I found online, and man, I want to read it if you don't mind.
Yeah,
If you
go ahead.
just give me a second. Man, it's one that has caused me to, like, even consider my own ways in which I communicate that I'm standing in solidarity with people. It has made me to, given me a chance to really think and reflect on if I am being who I say that I'm being, right? And it also reminds me of Jesus, right? Like, it says this, it says, if you want to be someone's ally, but haven't been hit by the stones thrown at them, you aren't standing close enough to them yet.
Mm,
And man, we talk about the incarnate Jesus. Think about, he was the chief cornerstone that the builders rejected.
yeah.
Think about Jesus. He was the one that took on the cross for all of humanity. He modeled what it meant to stand close enough. And it just really convicts my heart to examine, am I really standing close enough to my unhoused neighbor, my impoverished neighbor, my white neighbor, my Asian American neighbor, my indigenous neighbor, my Latin neighbor? I'm really, really thinking about this quote in the life of Jesus, and how I need to stand close enough. Um, and I would encourage you to consider the ways in which you need to stand close enough.
Mm, yes. Man, that's a great closing quote. Thanks so much, Terence. Thanks for jumping back on the flip side with us. It's awesome to have you back. Great job on the book. Listeners, I definitely, I'll promote your book for you. Listeners, check out All God's Children by Dr. Terence Lester. And Terence, thanks so much, man.
Thank you.
Ever heard the sound of freedom? Have you ever heard the sound of
We're back. And as I mentioned, I really encourage you to pick up a copy of All God's Children by Terence Lester, InterVarsity Press. A great place to start or to continue your journey on the cognitive solidarity that is needed. And I just want to say, for Terence, I think it's easy if you're listening to this podcast, to hear some of the national media attention that he's got for his work with Love Beyond Walls and the great stuff they're doing. And he's publishing books and he's being interviewed, and to think, I don't know, oh, he's got it made or something like that. Just know that what he's doing is a grind. He is on the front lines. He is taking huge risks. The things that he's doing, he's getting lots of what's the word I'm looking for? Resistance from. He's pushing up against political forces as well, and within the church, getting resistance. And so if you connect with Terence, if you enjoy the interview, I'd encourage you to just reach out to him and encourage him. He's very active on Twitter. His Twitter handle is I'm Terence Lester. It's I-M, the letters I-M, and then his name, Terence Lester. And to reach out to him there. On Instagram too, he's very active. And so let me see if I can find that. But my point is, just reach out and give him some encouragement that you listened to the episode, that you're rooting for him, you're pulling for him. As a ministry leader myself, that goes a long way. That goes a long way when one person who says they're pulling for you, that can help overcome, 10 discouragements that might have faced you that day. One last thing I was to someone who's, gotten the stones thrown at them or not, if they've hit you too. I think that's really powerful, and it reminded me of a scene from the movie Selma. So we're talking about movies and books. If you're not a reader, or if you just, add this to your viewing queue, the movie Selma, and there's a powerful scene in there. I cried during it because I am a white pastor who cares deeply about these things. There's a powerful scene where some white pastors come, I think, from the north to support Dr. King, and they get beat up bad. They get beat up bad by some folks in the South, and they're bloody and they're on the street. And I cried during that scene, and I can't remember. It's been a while since I've seen the movie, if it was connected in the same connection or not. But when Dr. King, I think the part I cried is when he talked about he didn't understand why more white clergy weren't coming to support him, why more white clergy from the north weren't coming to support him. And that just moved me, because I would come. I want to come. So just let the Spirit work in you in this. When we start to get proximate with people, and I really mean that about 1 Corinthians 12, when it says, when one part of the body suffers or feels pain, the whole body suffers and feels pain. I mean, that's how it's supposed to be. And we are a body that has inflicted harm on itself. So when we talk about history, it's really important that we understand that wasn't just non-Christian politicians, that the politicians, the police chiefs, the KKK Klansmen, Grand Dragons, these were Christians. These were Christians. People went from church to the lynching. I mean, it's historical. These laws were made by Christians, and the church was complicit in all of it. They had theology from the Bible to back this stuff up. So it's really important that for us today as Christians that we understand that, and that we say God has called us to something higher than this. We can't just let the status quo be the status quo, the way that it was created. So I hope that you're able to put the connections together in your own personal discipleship. So when we get proximate with people, when we do what Jesus did, which is really what we're talking about, let the Holy Spirit work in you in that. And that's going to look different for different people. But please let the Holy Spirit do this in you. It's a part of our discipleship that is lacking. It's a part of our discipleship that needs to be addressed. I mean, we stand accountable before God for what He's laid out in Scripture, and this is that needs to have. The flame needs to be fanned, and so that's what we're trying to do here on the flip side. I hope it's been helpful to you. I hope it's been done in a way that's you're able to receive it, and it's able to help you, and it's able to give you some next steps. So thank you so much for listening. Again, as we said in the intro, trying to make the flip side sustainable. There's two ways you can do that. If the flip side is helping you, if it's helping you in your walk and you're able to support it financially, you can go to patreon.com/Noah Filipiak for a small amount per month. Support the flip side. One other way that's free and is very helpful in helping make this show sustainable is just to find your favorite flip side episode and post it on social media, and write a couple lines about why you like the flip side or why you like this certain episode, and to encourage your friends and followers to listen. That would go a long way in helping us be able to continue to do the show, and to do it in a healthy way, which is really important. So thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next time on the flip side.
The Flip Side with Noah Filipiak is a Beyond Ministries production. Copyright Noah Filipiak. www.noahfilipiak.com. Theme music by Kyle Lake at K-Lake Music. Used with permission. Please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and subscribe wherever podcasts are found.
It's time to bring me closer. There's no purgatory, cause you're in or you're out. When you see them in the clouds, then you know it's going down. Raise them, raise them, raise them. They've been sleeping for some ages. Now all God's babies so confused by this hatred. Pulpit preachers shouldn't aim to be A-list. Money probably long, but short is what your days.